she said, I'm Cassidy Sugimoto. I'm in the School of Informatics and Computing. I'm going to present some of my research on gender disparities in science that I've been doing in collaboration with my doctoral student, Chao-Ching Ni, and our collaborator in Quebec. So before I begin, I want to contextualize with my motivations, what drives me to do the kind of research that I do. So I have a desire to understand the factors that impede and facilitate the growth of the scientific workforce, right? What tells us how we can have a healthy, dynamic, and sustainable scientific workforce? 3 areas that I've looked at primarily have been disciplinarity. That is how institutions facilitate and sustain, or maybe prevent scholarly communication from happening. Scholarly communication in general, that is the ways we disseminate and consume knowledge. So there was a question earlier about access to not just making scholarship available, but making scholarship accessible. And I like to think about those. So some of my research has been on TED Talks and other things and ways in which people make this accessible. And last, I look at mentoring, particularly doctoral mentoring. That is, how do we train and sustain the next generation of scientists? So there are a lot of assumptions upon which my work is based, and particularly the work that I'm going to be showing you today. And one is that the construction of a dynamic and healthy scientific workforce depends upon the maximization of the intellectual capital base. And by that I mean whatever kind of community you have, whether it's a local community, an institutional community, a disciplinary community, we have to be taking advantage of all the skills, all the expertise, all the people who are there, whether that's given on gender lines, racial lines, socioeconomic lines. We have to make sure that we're pulling that knowledge out of those communities and using it to the best that we can. And that involves then supporting this equitably and supporting this efficiently. So I use a lot of different methods in my research. I've done interviews and surveys, I've done content analysis, but primarily I use scientometric research methods and scientometric materials. And we drive those largely from huge citation indices, which you might be aware of, like the Web of Science. And here I'm going to talk about some data from the Web of Science, about 5.5 million articles that were published between 2008 and 2012, and data from the US Patent Office. And we'll be looking at about 4 million patents from there. Now I'm going to say some words in my talk: productivity, collaboration, and impact, and these words can mean lots of different things in lots of different places, so I'm going to just briefly operationalize those here. When I'm talking about productivity, I'm talking about output, right, the output of a journal article. And I'm going to be talking about male and female output, and what we're going to talk about that is fractionalized output. That is, if I'm one female on a paper of 5 authors, I've contributed 1/5 of a paper. Now we know that that's not how it works, right? So I understand the limitations of that, but that gives you a sense of how we're operationalizing it. Collaboration is co-authorship. That is 2 units appearing on the byline of an article. Now that could be 2 people, or 2 institutions, or 2 countries, right? Those are the ways in which we're looking at collaboration. And then impact is operationalized through citation. And believe me, I'm the last person to say that is the only way we should or do measure impact, but that is what we're looking at here. We're going to be talking about gender, and I don't have time in 5 minutes to talk about gender and sex and perceived gender, and I don't want to go into that, but leave it to say that we looked at individual names that were on articles and we assigned a proxy, right? So we said, okay, 10 times, more than 10 times likely that a Mary is going to be female and that a Thomas is going to be male, and I understand the limitations inherent in that, but this gives us an understanding, a general understanding on a large scale of what male to female productivity looks like. We also used a lot of different gender-specific lists, and I can go into that later if you're interested. So let's look at some data. Here's our productivity across the whole world. So this is contemporary. This is 2008 to 2012. More than 5.5 million papers published in Web of Science across all disciplinary areas. And darker the blue, the more male-dominated, and the brighter the pink, the more female-dominated. And if you saw an absence of color, that would imply gender parity. And as you can see, it's a blue world, right? And the United States is completely blue, meaning that men dominate the output in all of these papers. Now these are contemporary data, right? This isn't data from 1970 and things are changing. No, this is contemporary data. So you may say, well, that's all well and good, but in my discipline, it's different. Well, probably not. So probability would tell you that the output in your discipline is probably male-dominated as well. Each node here represents a discipline, and this is on the USCD map of science. We're moving from the hard sciences, engineering, to the natural sciences, to the medical sciences, to social sciences, and that little dangling node is the humanities, which is also very male-dominated in terms of output. Now, this doesn't mean that's the amount of people in the scientific workforce there. That's how they're producing the output and what they're producing. So collaboration, what does that look like? So what we're seeing here is by the most productive countries, their contributions to international and national collaborations. Now the biggest takeaway here is how these pink lines hang over on the national side and the blue lines hang over on the international sign. And that shows you that in all the most productive countries, the women's portfolios are more domestic. That is, they're not collaborating internationally at the same rate the men in that same country. Now in Switzerland, for example, you're going to have a lot of international collaboration, but even there, the women aren't participating in the international collaboration scene to the same degree as men. Now, does that matter, right? Who cares? Well, it starts to matter when we look at impact. If we think about citations as being the coin of the realm, that which distinguishes people in evaluation schemes in academia, well, women tend to suffer here on a number of cases. So the red in here shows low impact, the green higher impact, and these columns show single authored work to nationally authored work. So going to collaborative work helps. It gives you a citation boost. Then when you go to the next thing, to international collaboration, that again gives you a citation boost. Now, if you want to have a paper that receives the lowest citations, that would be one that was single authored by a woman, then single authored by a man. And then we move into the collaborations. If women are in dominant positions, that is their first author or their last author, those papers receive fewer citations than if a male is in a first authored place or in a last authored place. So there's a compound disadvantage here for women who are participating in this publication. They're not publishing internationally, which garners more citations, and their papers, where they're in dominant author positions, also receive fewer citations. So I mentioned patent data. We also looked at the USPTO database and the patents that were issued to men and to women. Now this is a longer time period. This is 1976 to 2012, but it's a pretty similar picture, right? Where we see that men dominate the production of patents in almost every country. Now this is changing over time. In 1976, 3% of patents were issued to women, and now it's at 13%. I'm not sure if I would call that significant progress, but it is progress. There are a couple new players on the scene though. South Korea and Taiwan are issuing a large share of these female patents, and I think that they're getting close to 30 to 40% of the patents issued in those countries are issued to women. Now, like disciplines, this is not, there's not one discipline that's going to have a lot of women. The same goes with patents and areas. But there are some areas which women fare a little bit better. Biotechnology, chemistry, and the pharmaceutical industries have more female patents than other areas. Aerospace and military technologies have very, very little female participation. So I'm probably at 5 minutes, so I'll stop and say, I've just given you a description, right? And what I started out says my desire is to understand what factors, right? What variables are working, not just understand what the status quo is, but why. And I'll just, without showing you a bunch of regressions and going into it, say that it's really complex, right? And I think you probably all know that, right? We have one structural thing. There's gender disparity. That's known. But why there's gender disparity in different countries, in different disciplines, in different places, in different time periods varies tremendously. And I think that's one of the reasons this complexity is why there's not a simple solution. We can't say, put this policy in place, right? Make a women in science center, and suddenly all of these disparities will go away. No, there are a lot of particularistic factors that have to be taken into account in that. And my goal is to continue to look at these particularistic factors and figure out the ways that we can do things, what we can do, what we can advocate for to introduce parity into the system. So, thank you. Questions?